So if you think of a coal stream having 12% CO2 in, okay, so that's what the concentration was, 12% CO2, 88% nitrogen or damn close to it. If you have a natural gas stream, you've only got 5% CO2, not 12. So your starting point is less than half what it is in a coal stream. So when people talk about post-combustion capture on that gas-fired power plant, that is a steeper mountain than a coal plant is.
Yeah. So thermodynamically, the least advantageous is obviously direct air capture, but natural gas is better, but not a whole lot. And coal's kind of as good as you get post combustion. A warm welcome back to Decouple. Today I'm joined by Ian MacGregor. I can't help saying that without a Scottish accent. Ian is a prominent Canadian entrepreneur, engineer, and advocate for carbon capture, utilization, and storage. He's the founder and chair of Enhance Energy, which was the primary driving force behind the Alberta Carbon Trunk Line. And so much more, Ian. I understand you've got a lot of ventures under your belt. You're on to the next thing now. It seems like you don't look very retired. But in any case, welcome to Decouple. And then tell us a bit more about yourself.
Okay, well, we can tell you. So I never had a job that I didn't make for myself, a permanent job. Started off, I was going to grad school because I couldn't find a job I wanted to do. And I'm in the grad student's office one day, and these two salesman guy comes in, and they're talking to the secretary, and they're saying, we want somebody to build a machine. I'm thinking, well, what did you come to the university for? But anyway, I go over and see them and say, I could build a machine like that. And they say, how much? I say, $5,000 because I make it $300 a month. And I have no idea how much this machine's going to cost, but I say $5,000. They say, okay, we'll let you do it. So I read the double garage, I laid in a milling machine and start building machines. It turned out that I was wrong on the estimate. It was probably worth $100,000 to build it. And, but I got started. So ever since then, my life has been, figured out the different kinds of businesses, how to own them, how to build them. And then once they work, I sell them because I don't like the part when you're, Betty's fighting with Sally, and I don't do that job.
So, Ian, suffice to say, it sounds like you've had a pretty atypical career, maybe even a maverick. I was put in touch with you by my good friend, Chris Popoff. He's been a former guest on Decouple a few times, done some great shows about the oil sands. And I wanted to chat with him about carbon capture and storage. And he said, I've got this great guy for you. He's actually built carbon capture and storage. So I thought that sounded like a pretty good pitch. I'm really interested in deep diving this topic. This podcast goes deep, mostly into nuclear energy, but we've talked a lot. We've had master classes on natural gas and oil and everything else. And we're 4 years in and a little bit delayed getting to this topic. So yeah, really looking forward to diving in. And I'm just trying to maybe lay down a bit of the context. I mean, we emit a whole bunch of CO2. It's fascinating seeing how much it's gone up since the good old pre-industrial days, kind of less than a gigaton. But even fairly recently, like what was it in 1950, we were just doing 6 gigatons.
Yeah.
I'm not sure when you were born.
49.
49. So yeah, back in the day, just 6 gigatons. So we're up to 40 now. So suffice to say, I mean, humanity is going pretty gangbusters on that. Just doing some rough calcs. Today's emissions level is kind of like 10,000 gigawatt scale coal plants, maybe at a 60% capacity factor, just kind of piping that stuff into the air. So it seems like a major challenge to capture that effluent, fighting some laws of thermodynamics. Can you tell me, like, where did the idea of carbon capture and storage come from? Does this come out of like early technologies to capture CO2 to put into beverages, and then we've upscaled it? You've been around for a while, so I'm just curious to kind of get at the history of the whole concept.
Yeah, I mean, I think where the idea comes from is enhanced oil recovery. So when you find an oil reservoir, say it's got 100 barrels of oil in it, you use all the conventional ways. So you drill more holes in it. Sometimes you pump water down those holes, and you can get some of that oil out. When you're finished with all the conventional methods, you've got about half the oil that was in the reservoir. So you got about 50 of the original 100 barrels out of it. When you put CO2 in, you reduce the viscosity of the oil in there if it's the right kind of oil, and the oil swells. And so you could get about half of what's left. So you can get about half of the 25 of the 100 barrels can come out if you use CO2. So people figured that out a long time ago and thought, wow, this is a great idea. What do we do now? Where do we get CO2 from? And so back in the day, it wasn't combustion CO2, it wasn't man-made CO2. I drilled a well, and in some places I could find CO2, pure CO2 in the formation. And so I would drill a well, get pure CO2, pipeline it to a place where there was oil, put it down there, and the oil would come out. So that was the start of all this.
Okay, that's fascinating. Yeah, because I think the first time I ever heard about geologic CO2 had to do with a natural disaster. I think in an African valley where the mountains were just right that it unfortunately trapped this cloud of CO2 that spontaneously was released and kind of snuffed everybody. I hear about geological hydrogen. I hadn't really kind of dwelled too much that there'd be enough of the stuff around to have used it a lot. Was this a big part of enhanced oil recovery, or
It was
pretty
the only
niche?
part that was the enhanced oil recovery business, and it's still enormous in the U.S. That's where most of the CO2, like probably more than 90%, probably more than 95% of the CO2 that's used per EOR comes from down there.
And is there any kind of percentage of wells that this is happening in? I guess it depends on having that local geologic CO2 nearby, but would you say this is common enough that like 10% of conventional wells are doing it at some point in their lifetime?
Yeah, I don't have good statistics on that. It's a certain kind of reservoir that this works on. So it doesn't work on all reservoirs. It has to be a certain temperature, has to be a certain viscosity of oil, and has to be at a certain depths because you want the CO2 to be, it's called dense phase, but it's essentially behaving like a liquid when you put it in the reservoir. So all of those things have to line up right. There's still a lot of reservoirs like that, like hundreds of them, but inside every reservoir.
Okay, so this is kind of where the concept comes from in terms of putting it underground anyway. In terms of developing the machinery, not to use the geologic source, but to strip it off of industrial processes, I recall vaguely Germany was in such sort of woes, and maybe it was an energy-related issue, or I'm not sure exactly what, but they were running out of CO2 to put into their mineral water, and that's a big deal in Germany. Like they really love their bubbly, natural spring water. That wasn't the biggest crisis Germany faced in the winter of 2022 or 23, but it just registered for me. So I'm just wondering again. This is kind of a long, drawn-out question, but what were some of the initial kind of industrial processes to capture industrial flows of CO2?
There's a few places where it comes from. It never came from combustion. No one ever has economically figured out a way to capture CO2 for combustion processes. So it came from process sources. So if you were doing something in your process, and usually the processes where I were making hydrogen for some other purpose. So I were making hydrogen for a fertilizer plant or an oil refinery, which are 95% of it, or 90% of the uses in the world. Or I was running a gas processing operation, and I had an amine system that was stripping out probably H2S, but it could get to CO2 at the same time. Then I'd be able to get the CO2 and use that for bottling purposes, you could say. And there are some other really, really trivial. So if you think of bottling sources, just to put those kind of numbers in kind of context, uh, there's a plant west of Calgary that it catches this really trace amounts of CO2 in a natural gas stream going by. It gets 25,000 tons a year. So, and that's enough CO2 for all the bottling plants in Western Canada. So it's not very much CO2. And then, of course, when you drink it, it comes back out again anyway, because some of us burp when
Guilty as charged, sir. Yeah. Maybe let's just kind of delve into this systematically. So in terms of capturing that CO2, I think you've talked about basically like pre-combustion, which should be things like steam methane reforming.
Yeah. So think of CO2 sequestration, CCS, having three individual components, and they all have to work. So the first one is, where do I get pure CO2 from? Because I can't move CO2 as a gas. It would just be, the pipes would be too big. They'd be 10 feet in diameter to move any reasonable quantity. So I have to make it into a liquid. They call it dense phase, but for most of us, we think of that as a liquid. And it means it's a compressible liquid, but it behaves like a liquid. When I make it into a liquid, then the volume I could get in a normal size pipe. So you can think of, 16-inch or 20 or 30-inch pipes that can move big quantities of CO2 around. So the first thing is, it has to be pure. And then the next thing is, I have to build a pipeline to move it around, because usually I'm making it in a different place from where I want to use it. And then the third thing I have to do is, I have to have a reservoir someplace that I can put it into. And so I need all three things. And one of the things that people forget a lot with this stuff is, all three parts have to work. So it doesn't do any good if I can build a pipeline, but the capture doesn't work. And it doesn't do any good if I can capture and have a pipeline, but the reservoir doesn't work. So all three things have to work. They have to work at the same time. And if they're big, there's really a lot of money involved. And so if you have any risk in any part of the system, then the money says, well, shit, we don't know if this is, sorry about my language, that's just the way I talk.
It's all good. Free speech.
If that part isn't going to work, I'm not going to give you the money until I'm sure it does work. And so what happens is a lot of people are talking about these things, but they're just nonsense because the risks don't line up and the cost of capital is too high to build it.
Right. Well, let's kind of move through this from, I guess, the source to the transit to the reservoir. So let's start with kind of the source of, again, I guess it's sort of pre-combustion, combustion, post-combustion. There's a few different technologies at play there. So in terms of actually capturing that pure CO2 stream, walk us through each of those, if you don't mind.
But I don't separate it the way you do there. So pre-combustion, there are some processes that aren't combustion. They're a process to make something. So the hydrogen making processes, so steam methane reforming is the most common of those things. And that's essentially a way to pull a water molecule and a natural gas molecule apart. So you put steam and natural gas in the thing. So you got, H2O and CH4, and you could pull those molecules apart and get hydrogen and CO2 out of them. That's what comes out the back end. And when you do that, you can get pure CO2 out of that process. And I'll just go off on a rant here for a second. So that's the way old plants do that. They just take steam with water in it, methane, pull the molecules apart. You get hydrogen and CO2, pure CO2 out the back end. Somebody realized about 35 years ago, there's a little bit of energy in that CO2 stream. There's got carbon monoxide in it, which is a low value fuel. So why don't I burn the whole carbon monoxide stream? Well, burn the whole CO2 stream to get to the energy in that minor contaminant of the carbon monoxide. The only problem with that is when I burned it with the atmospheric air that had nitrogen in it. So I contaminated the whole stream. So the start of the process was I had a stream that was about, 90%, 95% CO2, had this little bit of carbon monoxide in. Then I burned it, and I ended up contaminating the stream, so it's 40% nitrogen and 60% CO2 now. So modern reformers use that reburning process, and then that 40% of nitrogen that I got in there is really expensive to get out. Like that, you're talking about $85 a ton to get that back to 100% again. And I can't move it if the nitrogen's in there.
And is that nitrogen in the form of like nitrous oxides, or there's N2 in there?
No, it's just molecular nitrogen that came from the air. So the air, when I burned it, had oxygen and nitrogen in. I burned the oxygen and made it into CO2, and I ended up with a residual nitrogen in the stream.
Gotcha. Okay, so that's no good to capture then.
Well, the nitrogen is a liquid I'm old, so I'll use PSIs. 4,000 PSI, the nitrogen's a liquid. And the CO2 is a liquid at 1,000 PSI. So theoretically, I could move it as a liquid, but I'd have to pump the whole thing up to 4,000, and then the cost of doing that would be so high it was impossible.
Right. So you've called this like the dense phase of CO2. Do other people call it the supercritical phase? Is that?
Yeah, same thing.
Okay. So basically, it's still a gas, but it moves like a liquid. It's much more dense. You can push it through a 16-inch pipe and push a lot of it.
It looks like it behaves like a liquid, except the liquid is still compressible. So if you have a liquid like water, it's more or less incompressible. This dense phase or supercritical stuff is a little bit compressible.
You couldn't put it in a hydraulic digger or something and get any work done with it. It would squish.
It'd be bouncing around all over the place.
Right. Gotcha. Okay, so that's I guess one of the sort of pre-combustion ways of accessing a CO2 stream. I hear there's something called oxy-fuel combustion. I'm not sure if this is widespread at all, but can you just go through that quickly, just so we have a broad context for the listenership?
So theoretically, there are processes where they're combustion processes. So I burn something to get the energy that's in the carbon out, and if I separate the nitrogen out of the air in front of those processes, so I use oxygen rather than air to make the combustion process works, then what comes out the back end then is pure CO2. So that's the reason you would do that, is I get rid of the nitrogen in front of it rather than at the back of it. And so I can build something called an air separation plant, and that extracts air from, extracts oxygen and nitrogen as different streams from the air. That takes a lot of energy, though. So you got to put a lot of energy to get the pure oxygen, but you could do that theoretically. And then no one, I don't think, I mean, there's lots of research going on this, but no one's got any kind of reliable industrial machine that runs on oxy-fuel combustion.
Right. Okay. So more theoretical, and I guess like the more conventional one on the outside of this fitted to a few coal plants around the world. I think a few in Saskatchewan, Powder Dam.
So
Coal
there's
plant
one at
has
Boundary Dam in Saskatchewan.
Boundary
yeah.
Dam.
And
Yeah.
then there's
yeah.
another one in the States. I can't remember the name of it. So there's two coal plants that were tried with post-combustion. So I go to the exhaust of the plant and I put this machine at back. Usually it's a machine that uses a solvent called amine. So I bubble the gas from the exhaust of the coal plant through this solution of amine. And then the amine grabs onto the CO2 that's in that stream. And then I can heat up the amine. I could circulate it away from there, heat it up, and boil the CO2 above, and then send the amine back to be bubbled through the exhaust again.
Sounds complicated.
I thought it sounded simple when I said it, but it is complicated.
So there's this is something called the energy penalty that we should probably chat about that comes out of, I guess, either of these processes. As you said, oxy fuel combustion is not so much a thing yet, but there's probably a pretty large energy penalty. Let's talk about that energy penalty, and then also maybe compare this process to other things we do with flue gases, like electrostatic precipitation to get rid of particulates out of coal plants, or desulfuration scrubbers. Is this all in the same family? How do they compare in terms of that energy penalty that you
They're
gotta pay?
very, very low energies compared to this. I mean, these are enormous energy requirements because the stream is so large. Like you think of how much coal goes into a coal plant, and then I mix that coal with air. So if I got 12 carbon 12, I put 2 molecules of oxygen. So 16 times 2, 32 plus 12. I'm up to 44 now. That's what's coming out. So I got 40 for every pound of coal I put in, I got 44 pounds of something else coming out the back end of it. Sorry, every 12 pounds of coal, I have 44 pounds. These are enormous streams, like electrostatic precipitators, Chris. That's like, the drain in your bathtub compared to the river in front of your house. They're not the same thing.
Right.
Yeah.
And desulfuration, similarly, it's a tiny
Same
stream.
thing.
Right?
I mean, we don't burn high sulfur coals here anymore because it's just too you can't clean them up, and that's where acid rain came from. So we prohibited the use of those things. And I think it's a good thing. Like it's a good reference for your listeners. You can do things that are at the margin all the time. So I can always, if I got particulates in the coal combustion stream, I can push a little bit. It's not that expensive. It's expensive, but I can afford to do it because I'm just moving a little bit. When I talk about CO2 in the coal, I mean, that's what coal is. It's all going to turn into CO2. It's not like there's some small little thing, trace element in the coal I'm trying to get rid of. It's the whole goddamn thing. So it's just a different problem.
And I think I was doing a bit of research on this earlier. And so the electrostatic precipitators, the desulfuration scrubbers, they're each kind of fraction of a percent in terms of how much energy they gobble up from the plant. How does like the amine process compare to that?
So the numbers I said, I think you're getting to the 30% plus of the energy of the plant is a consumptive use when you start bolting those things onto it. And I think maybe people don't, if you're not in this, maybe they don't think about it so much. But when you have a modern coal plant, you use every scrap of heat you got. You take all the heat, the waste heat, you've got uses for that. And that allows you to make the plant more efficient. So back in the day, coal plants, when I was born, coal plants were like 30% efficient. Now they're up into the 50s and 60s of the combined cycle. But that's because I use all this crappy heat that's left over from the combustion process in different ways. If somebody comes to me and says, hey, I want to take all that waste, you call it waste heat, I call it, say, low value heat. I want to use that to boil the amine. Well, I don't have any waste heat. It was all integrated away to get to the proper efficiency. So I'm making the plant less and less efficient to do these things. And I think it just turns out they're just not really economically viable.
That's a challenge.
I have to be careful not to sound like one of those low guys on the Muppets because I sounded kind of negative. So
no, I think this is very illustrative, in terms of some first principles here. So, I mean, I guess what you're saying is that you've got to burn 30% more fuel just to power the amine scrubbers on the back end of this.
Yeah, it's the scrubbers and the compression because the exhaust in the coal plant is coming off at atmospheric pressure, just slightly above atmospheric pressure. And so you got to stack. It's hot gas, so it goes up. That's why it is, but it's very low pressure. So somebody wants to come along and put something in the exhaust. Have you ever seen that movie Beverly Hills Cop?
A long time ago, my friend.
Do you remember when Eddie Murphy puts the potato in the cop's exhaust pipe?
Yes, I do. Yeah.
Yeah, post-combustion capture. That's what that is.
You get 100%. It's going to leak out somewhere else probably, but this energy penalty thing's fascinating. Yeah, I've toured one coal plant. It was fascinating, but I'm more used to nuclear plants and seeing the primary heat transport pumps at the big CANDUs we have over in Ontario. They are some of the single biggest loads in the province, just some of the pumps circulating that massive amount of water. And I guess that's an energy penalty you're paying to circulate water, right?
Right. But it's the same thing.
Kind of, and that's kind of a percentage or two of the overall output of the reactor. So it gives you a sense that this is majorly energy intensive.
Yeah. The other thing that you'll find is the amine that you bubble through the exhaust, it doesn't like some of the combustion products. So if you use too much amine, it's like not the greatest thing to be having large quantities floating around because you got to get rid of it somewhere. And it's not like it's not like a nothing when you're disposing of it. And there's some things in the combustion products that don't like amine. And so they cause it to degrade faster than it might be in a more conventional, like a natural gas stream. The amine losses might be, 5% per year or something like that. In a coal stream, they might be 30 or 40% per year. And it just depends on what's in those combustion products. And the coal operations that I've heard of, I don't think are financial successes. The one in the States, they wrote off $500 million and had a restart. It's called a research project now. It's not called a carbon capture project anymore. The one in Saskatchewan, I don't hear much about it, but no one's bragging up saying they're going to do a whole bunch more of them out there. So, there's some kind of vector for how good are these things. Everybody in the free world is working on post-combustion capture. So there's hundreds of people working on it. And perhaps that will bear fruit someday, but it's really tough science and really tough thermodynamics.
Just a question about the amine again. I've heard of, I think it's called AdBlue, which is used in diesel engines to scrub out some of the nasties.
That's ammonia. That's not
ammonia.
Yeah.
So is amine's a nitrogen compound though, yeah?
I'm a mechanical engineer.
All right, fair enough. The problem is I get too goddamn curious.
You can't suck me into that vortex. No way.
Fair enough. Okay, so I think we've dealt with kind of the front end of this. We've talked about the energy penalty. We've, I think, painted a picture of what the various capture processes are. You mentioned you got to get this captured CO2 into a supercritical phase so that it's dense enough that you can push it around. I understand that supercritical phase is not just a matter of pressure, but also temperature. So tell me how CO2 pipelines are different than natural gas pipelines.
They're not. I'm just going to do one thing before we go to that. So if you think of a coal stream having 12% CO2 in, okay, so that's what the concentration was, 12% CO2, 88% nitrogen or damn close to it. If you have a natural gas stream, you've only got 5% CO2, not 12. So your starting point is less than half what it is in a coal stream. So when people talk about post-combustion capture on that gas-fired power plant, that is a steeper mountain than a coal plant is. Yeah.
Okay, that's vital. Yeah. So thermodynamically, the least advantageous is obviously direct air capture, but natural gas is better, but not a whole lot. And coal's kind of as good as you get post-combustion. Okay.
So we missed one part of these processes, and it's one that's called gasification. Okay, and so gasification is essentially, it starts with oxygen. So I have an air separation plant at the front end. So I have pure oxygen, and then I do partial combustion in a controlled environment, and I can use that process to make hydrogen and pure CO2. So they come out of it directly from this gasification process. And gasification was invented a long, long time ago in Germany, and that's how the Nazis made the oil for their Second World War. So they use gasification. So gasification is a well understood, well-known process. And that's what we did when we built the Sturgeon refinery, because we want gasification to take really low value carbon materials and make them into pure CO2 and hydrogen. And we needed hydrogen for the refinery anyway. And we had low value refining bottoms that were essentially all carbon to make it to use as a feedstock. So it was a good choice there. Gasification is a tough process because it hasn't been used for a long time very widely. So we had trouble with the startup, but we got it working eventually.
And so you're saying you're using, I guess, kind of bottom of the stack when talking about refining, some of those really, really high long chain.
Yeah. So the bottom of the barrel. So a refinery separates out all the different weights of material in there. The stuff you put in your car's diesel fuel or in your truck. And at the bottom is some really heavy stuff that if you let it cool down, it would look like pavement, but it's not. And so you can take that material, which is essentially worthless, and make it into pure CO2 and hydrogen in one proven process. So no technology risk, you just could do it.
Wow. And so there's enough, this is still a hydrocarbon chain. It's just got
Still
a
hydrocarbon,
ton
yeah.
of carbons on, and that's where your hydrogens are coming from in terms of stripping those away. Okay.
And so what I've been working on a lot in the last few years is you can take anything that has carbon in it. It doesn't matter for a gasifier. It doesn't care where the carbon comes from. It just has to be carbon. So you can take scrap wood products and put them in a gasifier, and under the right conditions, you get pure CO2 and hydrogen out of the thing. And that's a proven process. That isn't some science project. That's something that you could do at scale today. So I feel like Canada's got 8% of the world's trees. Trees are actually the only proven air capture machine that actually works economically. And we keep burning them down. And so when we have a forest fire in Canada, the smoke and fire takes about 40% of the tree away. And then the 60% of it is just left standing there. And right now it rots and goes back into the air. But I think that could be feedstock to make hydrogen and pure CO2. And when you sequester it, you're sequestering the carbon that the tree took out of the air. So I think we can do that at industrial scale here. And it's just a completely different path than all the other ones.
So what does this machinery look like? I've been interested certainly in how the Nazis, fueled the Luftwaffe, and the development of that machinery. I think it comes out of, the original sort of Haber-Bosch process. And then, hey, what else can we do? We don't have nitrogen. What other problem? Oh shit, we don't have hydrocarbons. Let's try and use this incredible German engineering prowess, chemical engineering prowess to do this process. But you said it's different than oxy-fuel combustion because you're only very partially combusting it. Is that right? High temperatures, high pressures?
It's high pressure, and you're making carbon monoxide, not carbon dioxide. And then you react the carbon monoxide to turn into hydrogen, something called the water to gas shift process. And so you could use you could react the carbon monoxide with water and end up with CO2 and hydrogen out of that.
Got you. And so in terms of your project, which we're going to get to in just a second, maybe after we just talk about some of the other challenges in terms of the distinctness in the pipeline and the reservoir, I do want to tie it in by describing the Alberta Carbon Trunk Line, because that's your baby. And that does really tie it all in together. But if we could kind of skip back, I guess, to the pipeline phase of this, you got to kind of compress this gas. How is the CO2 pipeline different than a methane pipeline or an oil pipeline?
It's not different. If you go to, they would ask me over to England once. There's all these people talking about, it's like blind people describing an elephant. It's like, it's a pipeline. If it's dry, if the CO2 is wet, you get carbonic acid, and that'll eat the pipeline out. So of course you dry the CO2 before you ever put it into there. So there's no water in that pipe. So it just behaves like a normal fluid that we pipeline every day in Western Canada. There's some things you have to do for bursting. So if the pipeline broke, you have to do some better metallurgy to make sure that isn't a problem. But it's well understood problem. There's thousands of miles of this stuff in.
Okay, I've got to confess something. I was attempting to ask a leading question.
Yeah.
For my amateur research, what I understand is to keep that CO2 in that supercritical state, that juicy liquid that will flow, it needs to be at pretty high temperature. 30 degrees C is what I heard. And I'm trying to think of, a pipeline winding its way through Alberta, and that seems improbable. Am I way off on that?
No, yeah. I mean, we're transporting that at, whatever temperature it is, and actually it becomes denser as the temperature goes down. So it's easier to move a little bit as the temperature goes down. And we don't do any special heating or cooling on the pipeline. The pipeline we built, I think, is about 250 kilometers long. And so one of the things that we do with that pipeline is there's a certain pressure that we have to put the CO2 into the reservoir at the other end. So we pump the pipeline up to that pressure right at the front end, so we don't have to have any intermediate pumping along the thing. And so I think the injection pressure. I'm sorry for mixing units, but it's about 20 watt per meter psi. So we pump it up to that at the start, and then that pipeline just operates at that pressure.
So maybe that higher pressure allows you a little more freedom in terms of the temperature, or maybe I'm just barking up the wrong tree of this whole temperature.
I don't think the temperature is a problem. Like we're worried when we're putting it in the reservoir that if the reservoir is too hot, it doesn't work right. Yeah.
Okay. Gotcha. All right. So we've captured that CO2 with whatever process we chose. It sounds like your processes are not post-combustion. It's got to do with this gasification mostly.
Yeah. I mean, I think the whole post-combustion world is a science project. And look at me, I'm too old to be doing those. I got to do stuff you can actually do.
You like to get her done and then move on, as you were saying. Okay, so we've pressurized that pipeline and we're pushing it along. We need an appropriate reservoir. So just describe what kind of geology we're looking at, because you can't just put the stuff anywhere.
So there's three types of reservoirs where you could put it. So there's oil reservoirs, and they're kind of sitting, they're sitting a fair way down. They're, 1,000 meters down, say they start at, that would make sense to do this. So there's oil reservoirs, then there's gas reservoirs, and depleted gas reservoirs, I believe, are a good home for this because they had gas in them. And so when you took the gas out, at least you're sure you got a secure container. So with an oil reservoir, there's oil in there. It would have leaked away if the container wasn't any good. So the container's good. Gas reservoir, I know that the container's good because it held gas for 10 million years before I got there. And then below them usually is a giant saltwater ocean that was in lots of places in the world, not just oil, but if you get deep enough, there's a saltwater ocean down there. So those are the three kinds of places where you could put big quantities of CO2. When you put it in the oil reservoir, the CO2 mixes with the oil, reduces its viscosity, and the oil swells a bit. So then the oil comes out easier. So you get that oil out of there. When you put it in a gas reservoir, you're just putting it back into a space where there used to be gas and there's nothing there now. So you're pretty sure if I don't get above the pressure that the gas was in there, I know I can put a big quantity in. However much gas came out, I could put that much CO2, maybe more back in because it's a liquid. And in the saltwater ocean, when I put it in the saltwater ocean, I'm relying on the compressibility of the ocean to allow it to come in. So, we all think that water is incompressible, but it's not really. It's a little bit compressible. The ocean is so big that little bit means a lot. I can put a lot of CO2 down there, but it's a little, I'm compressing something, and I don't have any real physical experience operating in that ocean because there was never any reason to drill down into it, put things into it before. So every well I drill has the risk of an exploration well. It might be good, might be bad. I got to drill it, look, I got to do some testing. I don't have any seismic. I never shot seismic over these reservoirs. So they're all a different kind of science project.
Yeah, just to clarify on this underground ocean thing. So this is a bunch of water. It's mixed with sediment, right? It's just saturated sediment. It's not like a cavern full of water.
No, it's a saltwater ocean, but it's essentially in the rock.
In the rock.
So okay. It's like a block of sandstone down there, and the ocean is in the water in the pores of that rock. So the rock's still there, but the ocean is in lots of places because everywhere there's a hole in the sandstone, there's a reservoir. There's salt water.
Okay, so you're not able to kind of reuse the existing wells that were used to drill that field. Those have hopefully been capped really well, so there's no kind of leaking hydrogen sulfides or things like that. You're needing to drill a whole new set of wells and explore essentially to find the right geology to put this carbon underground in. Is that correct?
Well, if you're in an oil reservoir, you could reuse some of those wells. Usually, if you're in a gas reservoir, you could reuse some of those wells, and you can often reuse the facilities that were designed to produce the oil or to get the gas out. A lot of them pipelines and wellheads, and all the stuff, the operating stuff is still around, the roads to get it there, all those things are all there. When I go to the saltwater ocean, no one's ever been there before. I don't know where it is. I got to shoot seismic, then I can see it. Then I drill some holes into it and test those holes. And maybe something goes in. Maybe the reservoir's no good where I drilled. I got to move over a mile, try again. So the saltwater ocean is absolutely the most risky part of the whole thing. Shell did a project in Alberta at their Scotford refinery called Quest. And that was first of the large-scale projects that I know of real saltwater sequestration.
Well, okay, let's get more specific then. Now that we've kind of covered the whole life cycle of this project, let's introduce a real project, the Alberta Carbon Trunk Line. First off, I mean, this sounds pretty world-leading. Is this one of the biggest pieces of carbon capture infrastructure that's been built?
Well, I think that the biggest one in the world is Weyburn. And so Weyburn has put about 40 million tons of CO2 in. And actually, Weyburn is where I got the idea to do all this stuff. So I used to be partners with an oil company called Pan Canadian, which is the old CPR oil company. And so Pan Canadian had the idea they wanted to do enhanced oil recovery at this Weyburn oil field in Saskatchewan. And Weyburn was an enormous oil field, 1.4 billion barrels of oil it placed. And it was on its last legs because it had been found in the 50s. And then about, 1998 or something, somebody at Pan Canadian got the idea, if we put CO2 in that oil field, it would go back to its original 25,000 barrel a day productivity. That would be pretty good. So they started studying it and they tried to figure out where the hell are we going to get CO2 from? There isn't any CO2 around. It's all combustion CO2. But strangely enough, in Beulah, North Dakota, they had built a coal gasification plant. So they were gasifying the carbon in coal there. And so they were getting hydrogen and pure CO2. Well, actually, they were getting something. They made it into methane there. So they got CO2 and methane out of that plant. And they were just venting the CO2, but it was a lot of CO2. It was like, I'm going to say 6,000 or 8,000 tons a day of CO2 that were coming out of that plant. So Pan Canadian went and made a deal with the guys at Beulah, build a pipeline up to Weyburn, which was about, 300 or 400 kilometers, something like that. And they were going to do this. And there was a problem in the plant and the problem with the commercial sort of structure of the thing. And so I knew the guy banking and he said, well, can you go down and help us out with that thing? We'd like you to look into it. We don't have anybody that's a crazy guy like you. So we want to send you down there. So I go down and I paddled away with these guys and got the problem fixed up. And so when I came back, the guy says, so what can we do for you? And I said, well, why don't you let me buy part of Weyburn? And so the guy said, well, yeah, we sold a lot of it, but we've got 11% left. So we know what the price we want to sell it is, but we've got 11% we can't sell. How about we sell you that? So I say, okay, that sounds good. Then I say, I don't have any money. And he says, yeah, I know, we'll lend you the money. So they lent me $70 million to buy 11% of Weyburn. And then I financed out of that later and got it. So that worked out okay. So that's where I got the idea. Why isn't somebody doing this in Alberta? This is stupid. Because there's all kinds of oil. I think there's 1 billion barrels of oil in the central part of Alberta to get out of the ground, and it'll take about 4 billion tons of CO2 to get it out. So this is a good place to do this because there's something that's going to pay for all this, infrastructure to be built and put the CO2 in a place where it can't come back.
Wow. 4 billion barrels. I was just, with all the tariffs going on and this terrible situation that we're in Canada, I was just getting a sense of, how many million barrels per day Alberta's producing. And it's like 3.5 million. It's 3.5% of world oil production happening in Alberta. I mean, I'm just a humble Canadian, but I was pretty blown away by that.
So, we have arguably in Alberta, there's like 160 billion barrels of proven oil sands reserves. And so in oil sands, you mine the top stuff, so you get the top stuff out that you could, you can't get too deep because the mine gets too expensive. Then right at the bottom there, I can put steam in and heat it up, but I got to be pretty deep because the steam wants to come out of the ground if it's not deep enough to keep it in. And in the middle, it's still all oil sands. So the 160 billion barrels of proven reserves we got are the top and the bottom. The middle stuff has 1.7 trillion barrels of oil in it. It's the largest thing in the world. Maybe Venezuela has something that side. Nobody else does. So some, people are good at figuring out how to get that stuff out of the ground. It'll come out someday, I think.
That's wild. That's wild. Okay, so Haber sort of inspires the Alberta Carbon Trunk Line. Yeah, describe that for us. We've kind of theoretically gone through what the pieces of the puzzle can be, but I understand there's a refinery hooked up to this, Sturgeon Refinery. What else?
So there's an Agrium 2 or nutrient fertilizer plants. When you make fertilizer, you need hydrogen. So that's the start of getting pure CO2. Those fertilizer plants are old, so they make pure CO2. It's not, they don't have the modern kind of reformers in them. So pure CO2 is coming out of them. And when I conceived this, I don't know how much you know about the Alberta Gas Trunk Line.
No, not much.
So I'll tell you a little. So that's where. So when I was about 4 years old, somebody in Alberta, the premier of the day, which was Ernest Manning, got together with C.D. Howe, and they said, "We've got all this gas in Alberta, and we can't sell it. What should we do?" And so C.D. Howe and Manning cooked up the idea of building the Trans-Canada Pipeline, and they built essentially the Alberta Gas Trunk Line in Alberta to collect all the gas. And so that pipeline started off with about a 20-mile piece of pipe on the Saskatchewan border. It ended up going everywhere in Alberta, went to every place in Alberta has got Alberta Gas Trunk Line in. So when I started thinking of I was thinking of this as a system. So I looked at it and said, look, I'm going to build an oil refinery. I believe that we have to do something about carbon. I'm going to make it easy to do something with CO2. So I'm going to make pure CO2 in the first step. And then what I'm going to do is try and build the rest of the system so I could take the CO2 from the refinery and use it. So that's the Alberta Carbon Trunk Line system. And it was designed to take CO2 to the oil reservoirs in Alberta and get the UR business started. And what I thought was that once you get the sort of base infrastructure in place, then the system will grow organically without a bunch of crazy government subsidies that no one could afford. I thought, if you can just get the thing to grow, and if the oil can pay for the system, then eventually you'll get to the depleted gas reservoir. So you won't get any money out of it, but you'll have a really cheap system to get CO2 in. And then after that's all filled up, which will be long after you're dead, not me, I'll be dead way sooner before that, but after we're both dead, somebody will be putting CO2 in the saltwater aquifer below it, because all the infrastructure will be free and paid for at that point. And so our government got that all backwards. So the order they're doing it is, it's the backwards order to not get stuff done.
Sounds pretty typical. Okay. So this is a trunk line, meaning you've connected two industrial sites, and you've probably sited it in such a way that what you're suggesting is there'll be more feeder pipelines to be able to come in from other carbon sources and tag into that. And then, so it's like, I guess the trunk, you've got these branches on the tree and it's coming into the trunk. That makes sense. But then you have to get out, presumably, to a bunch of different reservoirs. I'm trying to get a sense, like the volumes that have been sequestered now, I think, was that at 4 or 5 million or?
No, it's about 8 million tons now.
Okay. And is that all happening in kind of one reservoir? You're having to build, I guess, like that Celtic tree where you have all the, the branches coming into the trunk, and then at the other side you got all the roots spinning out. Do you have to send a bunch of roots out to different reservoirs, or?
So if you look on our map and see where the trunk line routing goes, I tried to pick a route that went through the best oil reservoirs, the highest potential oil reservoirs in the province. So it's got kind of a funny shape to it, but it went through those places because it went to good oil reservoirs on the back end. So there's hundreds of oil reservoirs along that route. And I tried to build as far as I could with the money I had, and the government helped us out. The Alberta government helped us out, so it was about a $1.2 billion system. And the government gave us about $400 billion, and we used that to build a longer and bigger system, so the trunk line has lots of capacity of it. So today the trunk line's only flowing 1.5 million tons a year, but it's got the capacity for 15 million tons a year, and that's all for the future, and it'll get built out eventually.
Again, we're talking about the kind of economics of post-combustion, and it seems terrible because you got to burn 30% more fuel to power the amine process. That just doesn't make a whole lot of sense. In terms of making this economically viable, again, you said, at least in the initial stages, enhanced oil recovery is kind of how you can make these projects self-financing. To what degree do they, at this point, still require government subsidy in the form of tax credits or other sort of sweeteners?
It, you know, the thing that people forget with these things, I think, is the projects last a really long time, and so they're slow paying out. It takes maybe 10 years to get your money back, just to get back to zero without any interest costs in the average one of these things. And so the projects have to be durable through different kinds of governments. So sometimes you'll have liberals, sometimes you'll have conservatives in Canada, sometimes you might have something else. It has to work in all political environments because today we have high, what we call clean fuel standard taxes. So sometimes those taxes in Alberta or not in Canada, not just in Alberta, are north of $200 a ton. And we have a different kind of tax in Alberta that is in addition to that. It's called the tier tax, and it's equivalent with a different kind of federal tax. And today that's about, I don't know, $65 a ton. So you take $200 a ton from CFS, add $65 a ton from the tier taxes in Alberta, and that's enough to get some kind of economics to get these things built. But when you look at it, if you're building a 20 or 30-year project, they're saying, shit, I got to rely on that for 30 years. I wonder which government's going to be here when I'm getting my money back. You can't rely on those things. And that's why I say, if you're going to, the oil revenue is at least predictable and consistent, and you can build a system at reasonable cost if you anticipate getting oil revenue. The rest of it's all government subsidy land, and sometimes it'll work and sometimes it won't. That's why nothing's getting built. Everything's getting talked about, but in terms of what's been built, the last thing got built when I built it. It's like, I don't know, sure, it must be 20 years ago now.
Right. So without that enhanced oil recovery, these projects won't happen because investors are going to go, hey, in 4 to 8 years, I might lose all these subsidies that would make it viable without enhanced oil recovery attached to it.
And so in a good oil reservoir, you think you get 2 barrels per ton of CO2. So that's about that's as good as it gets. But that's enough, that's, you think $150 a ton of revenue I'm getting, I can get them to work. And if I have infrastructure there that's paid for, I could do it at lower cost. So the costs of the infrastructure are depreciating over time. So things that are less economic will be possible in the future because the infrastructure is amortized. But if I don't have the infrastructure in and getting amortized, good luck, I'm trying to do a new one.
It's really explains the metrics behind it, because I've been obviously paying attention to politics south of the border, and it is the age of hydrocarbonophilia down south of the border. Really kind of I did an interview yesterday with a China expert, and we talk about decoupling of China and the U.S. economies in terms of decreasing vulnerabilities, reshoring critical industries, strategic industries, et cetera. But now there's this great sort of decoupling in terms of China going the electrification route because they just don't have the oil and are pretty vulnerable to, maybe getting it in if there was a war or blockade, and the U.S. kind of going whole hog because those are the resources that they have. So, it's curious to think about whether some of the subsidies under the Inflation Reduction Act or whatever will be there south of the border in terms of supporting carbon capture and storage projects.
Yeah, I think when I think about China, so they're the leader in adoption of electric cars. And so everybody's thinking, well, geez, that's a good thing for the world. China's got all these electric cars running around. Where's that electricity come from? These are coal-powered cars. And the reason that they're doing that is because coal's cheaper than oil, and I can make electricity from coal, and then I could put it in the cars, and I've reduced my oil imports, and I've got local reserves or really cheap reserves of coal. They're not doing that for any environmental reason. That's pure economics. They're trying to get people mobilized.
Yeah, and energy security, absolutely. We have a whole episode on that I'll refer our listeners back to. The tangents are dangerous. I was wondering maybe, and if you're up for it, we got another 10 minutes or so. Obviously, tariffs are in the news. You mentioned C.D. Howe. He made a very important decision with that Trans-Canada pipeline to route one pipe over the Great Lakes. I guess it was a huge pain in the ass to do so, but just I think for energy security reasons. But when we have members of the federal government talking about potentially cutting off oil exports and having some kind of an energy war with the U.S., it's been pointed out by people who, I think know their stuff, that this isn't a particularly great strategy, given that a lot of the oil products that make their way out east have to go through the U.S. Could you, if you got a few minutes, I'd love to hear from an oil man who really gets this. Just lay that out for us if you can.
We've been going through this refinery optimization, and it started 30 years ago. We used to have all kinds of little tiny refineries all over the place, because we didn't have a good distribution system and it was inefficient to move it. So wherever we could, we'd have a small oil refinery. And over the last 40 years, say, we've shut down most of those small oil refineries. So if you're down in Eastern Canada, look around and see where all the oil refineries are, and you'll find that there's some really old, antiquated ones that people have been trying to sell and no one wants to buy. There's one or two of those down there, and then all the rest of them have been shut down. They're turned into terminals because if you own the refinery site, it's a big problem to clean it up. So you make it into a terminal, and then you receive refined products out. So where does that refined oil come from? We send bitumen down to the Midwest, and there's a bunch of big refineries in the American, but not the Canadian Midwest, the American Midwest. We send bitumen dilbit down there. Their refineries are configured to utilize bitumen, so they don't like running on anything except bitumen. And they make gasoline and diesel fuel, and that gets shipped up to Eastern Canada. So if you have an energy war with them, I'm guessing they might not send that diesel fuel up to you anymore, and I don't know where the hell you're going to get it.
It wasn't quite a Dr. Evil laugh, but it was a pretty good one.
When you're talking about cutting off your nose, you want to pay attention.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, we have a lot of petrochemical infrastructure at Sarnia in Southern Ontario, but I understand a lot of that is coming through that Trans-Canada and dipping down stateside to get around the Great Lakes. Okay. So this is not really an option.
I don't know how it can be. I mean, I guess you could quit driving cars. Then it is.
Well, listen, this has been a fascinating conversation. I don't know if you have any other closing thoughts on this topic or any topic. I'm going to try and find an excuse to have you back because this has been a lot of fun.
Well, it's the only thing I close on is there's way too much bandwidth given to new technology and high technology. Like this is a well studied field by really smart people over half a century to evolve the system that is complex and carefully operates today. And there's no hidden pots of gold anywhere in it. We all know where the pots of gold are. They're really small. They're a changed purse of gold somewhere, but there's no pots of gold. And we kind of got the world is all changed now where I get to announce these crazy things that don't obey the laws of thermodynamics. So all of this starts with the thermodynamics has to work, and then the money follows the thermodynamics. So when the thermodynamics don't work, you don't even have to check on the money. And we announce these things like they're going to turn into something. And there's like an announcement a day of this stuff, but it's like these are impossible physics and thermodynamics. And so our government seems to be so focused on the bright, shiny objects. This is an evolutionary thing. It's very slow change. It's an enormous system. And so if I want to change it, I'm pushing on a bulldozer with, a 4-year-old kid. He can't move it. And that we have to start thinking about, I can make small evolutionary continuous improvements. If I send a consistent economic signal, the system will gradually adapt and it'll do the most efficient thing economically. And if you don't do that, you'll never get anything done. You'll just be announcing forever. And so I keep going into it and saying, how much is the average family prepared to pay to mitigate CO2? I say $400 a year. You can probably get away with that in a place like Canada, $400 a year. Okay, that is $6 or $7 a ton of Canadian emissions. You can't do much for that. So you got to concentrate it on the places where you can actually do something. You can't spread it over everything or nothing happens.
Now, I don't want to put you on the spot to make you name names or anything like that, but broadly, in terms of what you're speaking about here, is this in the kind of post-combustion side of carbon capture? Are you speaking more broadly in terms of other industries? Because a lot of this is ringing true the way you're speaking about the nuclear industry as well.
Yeah, I think what you do is you look at where can I make a difference right now? What can I do? Where can I do something I know how to do? And it might not be quite economic. Maybe I can give it a little tiny push. It's like what they did with Trunk Line. $400 million made it so it's 4 times as big as we could have made it, and it's twice as long. Wow, that opened up a lot of stuff for the future, right? And it's depreciating and paying for itself. Where can I make those kind of investments on something that doesn't sound sexy? Like building the Trunk Line bigger didn't sound sexy to anybody, but it was the right thing to do. And that's the problem with this world. They're trying to make sexy things actual, and they don't work.
All right, well, what better place to leave than that, my friend?